Welcome to this journey where we dialogue with thought and heart leaders to share their reflections on human condition and how to improve them.
Today we have with us Gaurav Dalmia. Gaurav Dalmia is the chairman of the Dalmia Group Holdings, a holding company for business and financial interests. He's an early investor and a board member of True North, a leading Indian private equity fund. He's also the board member of Brookings India and a member of the governing board of the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York. He's also the chairman of the Indian Advisory Board of Room to Read, a global education charity.
To understand how they're trying to make sense of this evolving situation. So if you can take us through some of the initial thinking around how you are trying to make sense of the evolving situation.
The way I'm looking at it, the lives and livelihood debate is becoming very real and stark. As I was mentioning to you earlier, in fact, this morning, quite by chance, there's an article by Ruchir Sharma in the New York Times. And the headline is, will people die of coronavirus or will people die of hunger? And that is a difficult choice many governments and societies will have to make willy-nilly. Now, it takes a very extreme form as a trade-off to make his point, but I think that point is very real, which our decision makers face today. Now, having said that, I believe that our evolutionary instincts are such where we tend to exaggerate current challenges, and those are our survival instincts. Okay, if we didn't do that, we wouldn't survive. And I think something similar may be happening to the current coronavirus situation. So let's look at a few numbers. If you look at infection rates in Italy, okay, which has a high infection rate, it is about 0.26% of the population. If you look at US infection rates, where the absolute numbers are amongst the highest in the world, but relative to the population, it's 0.16% of the population. India has cases are growing, but it's tapering down a little bit. But we have challenges in India of limited testing. So today, I believe there are about 150 odd government centers that are testing. There are 70 or 80 odd private centers that are testing. And given this, it's a very small testing base that we have in India. Okay, so that obviously worries me. Okay, most of the deaths in Italy, I think 85% or so, have happened to people over the age of 60. So in some manner, given our younger population on average, we have some sort of cushion. Having said all this, I do believe that this thing will play out better than the most pessimistic forecasts out there. And that's the bet we are making, at least.
Interesting.
Now, as far as business is concerned, we are looking at three different segments of analysis. We've done that with our portfolio companies, with our own businesses, and I would encourage everyone to look at it that way. First, we are looking at an economy-wide level. When will the lockdowns lift? What might be the implication of that? This is a macro analysis. Nobody has an answer, but you've got to make an intelligent guess. Then we come to your industry, saying, how will demand in your industry pick up and normalize? So, for example, FMCG sales will pick up faster than consumer discretionary. Big ticket items like cars or real estate will pick up even later. And you can build in these lags, right, in demand. Now, there will be some noise in between, in the sense, Maggi sales may take a spurt because people are hoarding. Now, that's not indicative of anything, right? It'll just be noise from the market. There's no signal value to this. So you may have these aberrations, positive or negative, in the interim, and you've got to kind of ignore that and normalize that. So once you have a view on how your industry may play out, then you come to specifics to your company. Your company, for argument's sake, let's say is based in Pune. My company in the same business is based in Gurgaon, suburban Gurgaon in Haryana. You will have different dynamics of ramping up production by getting labor backing. I will have different dynamics. Your supply chain in certain ways may be stronger than mine. My supply chain in certain ways may be stronger than yours, which I'll only discover as I try to ramp up production. So you've got to be able to break up the macro, which is when will opening happen, your industry characteristics and dynamics, and the unique situation of your company. Now, in one way, you can argue this is a futile exercise. Nobody knows what's going on. These are darts in the dark, etc., etc. But as it's said, plans are often useless. But the process of planning is very valuable. So I'm more looking at the process and thinking through this so that as reality unfolds, you've internalized the responses rather than guessing at that point. So that is what we're advocating to the various profit center heads that we deal with. Now, let's look at an example of how certain habits may be sticky. So if you look at 9/11, travel took almost 18 months to go back to normal after 9/11 in the US. Okay, so certain lags may be longer than we think because consumers are apprehensive, sometimes even illogical, and so on and so forth. So those may drag down the so-called recovery, even though a lockdown may open much sooner. Now, let's look at where the world may be headed. So if you look at the Great Depression, 1929, the contraction was 6% to the global economy. Okay, that's the worst in recent recorded history. If you look at 2008, in 2008, growth fell down from 4.3 odd percent to 1.85%, but it was still positive. The economy still grew. It fell from growth of 4.3% to 1.8%. Okay, and then it shrunk by 1.5%, I think, in 2009. Okay, and then it started growing the year after. I think the growth spurt was 4.3%. The forecast for this time round is actually 3% slowdown in global GDP, slowdown in absolute terms. So when you put it in context, okay, it'll be worse than 2008 for sure, but it'll be nowhere near the Great Depression. Some people are articulating that it will be worse than the last Great Depression and so on and so forth. Okay. And recovery may be therefore 1.5 years, 2 years, 2.5 years. It's certainly not 6 months. If it's worse than 2008, I don't think it'll recover in 6 months.
It's a longer cycle.
Yeah. So there are 3 segments that we've actually studied, okay, within this vertical segments. One, we've studied auto because we have some investments in that sector and so on. And auto is important because it's 7% of India's GDP. Auto related, including insurance of auto and so on and so forth. So it's a very big sector. Now, it may have challenges, not just because of BS4 inventory. I'm told there are 700,000 BS4 two-wheelers in inventory still. Okay, I believe Supreme Court has given some judgment that they will give relief on selling of those for 10 extra days or whatever. Right. But also because of the NBFC and the financing crisis. Take textiles, where Bangladesh has been eating our lunch already. Okay. India has about 440 million working people. 10% of these are directly employed by textiles. And if you take direct and indirect put together, almost 23% are employed by textile and related sectors. Here the problem may be global demand is slowing down. As the demand picks up, or whatever demand is there, factoring agents and intermediaries who would de-risk supply from exporting countries to developed markets, they have gone out of the game. So you may have a hit, not because demand is not there, but one big chain in that process is missing. So we have to do something about it. I'm just taking these two examples because one is a very large percentage of GDP. Second is a very large percent of employment.
Yeah.
You take cement, high cost, fixed cost basis. So 1 or 2 lost quarters will impact the whole year. Steel, etc., will be much worse, because of the high cost nature. And then you will look at individual companies, what leverage they have and what they don't. But I think the biggest challenge, forget these vertical segments, will be in the SME sector. If we can keep the SME sector going in terms of liquidity, I think things will recover fast. There are hidden problems out there which will only come up as the recovery starts, which we'll discover in the next 12 months. So for example, we have proposed to the government that use some of the fintech platforms which already have registered SME vendors to fund them directly. Otherwise, just telling banks to fund it or just giving money to banks and hoping SMEs will get money, that transmission is not going to be easy. Okay. Now, in the meantime, we have a situation, public markets are doing very well, or not doing very well, have recovered. So there is this hope, which I think is misplaced, that, oh, public markets have recovered, things are going to be good soon. Now, first of all, public markets are irrational, often. Second, they swing much more than the economy, right? Third, to some extent, the recent upticks in the markets have to do with global liquidity than to do with economic facts on the ground. Okay, so you have to be aware of that. Fourth, stock markets rally ahead of an economic uptick in any case because they anticipate an economic uptick. So just because there is a mild rally doesn't mean our problems are behind us. That's only betting that the problems will be behind us in the future. And there are way too many moving parts in all this for us to take any signal from it. So for those who see relief in that, I would say, please don't see any relief. It's just a piece of noise for the time being. Focus your business on cash flow, not so much on profit. Now it's easier said than done. Right? We encourage all our companies, please focus quarterly, monthly cash flows to the extent you can. So that's our take on the economic and business side of the current downturn.
Very interesting. That was pretty elaborate, Gauravji. I think I would parse this in two parts. The one where you mentioned the evolutionary instincts that are the guiding forces, and then you passed it in a beautiful way in terms of looking at, as what Buckminster Fuller would have said, outside-in approach. You look at the economy, you look at the industry, you look at the company, and then within the company also you focus on the cash flows and the brass tacks there. Couple of interesting questions that come up is when you mention that there are these evolutionary instinct, and if I just step back, then on one side you have the leadership of the country, let's say the business leadership, the social impact leadership, the political leadership. Then you have the media. Now, are we saying that in them they're being not reflective but reflexive to the thing? Are they getting bogged down by these panic numbers that are showing up on the screens every day?
It's difficult to sit outside a decision maker's table and second guess them. These are indeed complex decisions, and they have to be made in the heat of the moment. And therefore, to sit outside and with whatever my view is, has no consequences in some sense, right? Whatever decisions a decision maker in the hot seat is making has severe consequences. So it's a lot easier for us to become an armchair decision maker than for people in the hot seat. Now, having said that, there are various trade-offs, right? One, I was reading an article, I think, in Project Syndicate, which was very good on this. There's a Rawlsian kind of point of view. The Rawlsian point of view is, how are the people at the bottom of the pyramid affected? Should we overemphasize that? On the other hand, there is a utilitarian viewpoint saying, how will society as a whole get affected? And the answers to those two different challenges may actually be different.
Correct.
Right. Then there is a libertarian standpoint. How can you do this? How can you impose that? And so on and so forth. Right? On the opposite side of that, there's an authoritarian standpoint saying, why can't we all get together and instead of debating, just carry on with life? This is a crisis. So you've got so many different forces and viewpoints and even values at play, right? What do you optimize for? Right? I wouldn't second guess. I think we are overwhelmed, like anyone would be. Managing 3 teenage kids for me was a challenge. So managing a country for Mr. Modi has got to be a very big challenge.
Yeah, I think you responded to that very beautifully in terms of even laying out the maximum principle of John Rawls and the libertarians and stuff. In what ways do you see this these different value systems, which at least apparently look slightly divergent, have they been heightened in some way in the past few decades? Because I remember reading one of your articles, which you were responding to Business World, and you mentioned that your wonderful family was involved in the freedom struggle in a very big way, and you set the context saying that in those days, in those times, the motivations were very different, the value system was very different, and you got a lot of people rallying around a certain purpose, common enemy. Do you think in the last few decades, somewhere, the way we've got this construction of the society going, where there's no obviously a global CEO, but the way we have come to become, there are certain features of it which doesn't allow for pluralistic argumentation and an interdisciplinary thinking.
You know, let me put on my citizen hat for a second, right? Not a businessman's hat. If you look at what the consensus in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s was, right, very few people would have bet that India will stay as one united country. Forget prosper. So at birth, there were very serious existential debates about India around the world. The fact is, if you take those worst case type of predictions, or even most expected outcomes from that time, which we tend to forget now, right? I think we've done much better than that. So in that sense, I do think that things work. They may not work beautifully, they may not work as well as we want them to work, right? But in the range of outcomes that was possible, we had a pretty decent outcome. And you only have to look at other countries, what's happening in other large countries, to know how much we've been able to achieve. Now, I think our best feature of our country has been that even though we are a very big and heterogeneous country, we've been able to stick together and work out the differences. Okay. We do have fault lines, like any society would have. Raghuram, Rajan wrote this book on community last year, I think, or the year before, right? And how we need to empower communities to come out rather than just governments and so on and so forth. And I think our community actually is working well. You have to just go deep into India and you'll see. There's a great piece by Francis Fukuyama from the early 90s, and it's a tome on trust. How societies that trust, have innate trust, prosper more than societies that don't have this innate trust. And I would say trust levels in India are actually, in absolute sense, quite good. Okay. And therefore, that makes me optimistic. Now, we're a democracy, and we have challenges of a noisy, argumentative democracy. One of the challenges is it slows us down. We know that. This is the oft given reason why we can't be China. Okay. Second, I can't remember who the German philosopher was who said democracies are in some ways destined to be populist. Every 5 years, you have an election cycle. It's difficult for performance to show up in this 5-year cycle, and therefore democracies are kind of destined to be populist. So to me, it's not surprising that some of the things that are going on, which you may intellectually disagree with, you just say this is a feature of democracy. By the way, not all populism is bad. I'm not taking a free market, Chicago school type of point of view. I'm saying populism beyond a point may be bad. And that may be a function of the democratic nature. So on a net basis, it's still okay. Having said this, I would say even the middle class of India has no clue as to what India's poverty looks like. Middle class person thinks, oh, he's suffering, or people he sees around him are suffering in a certain way or prospering in a certain way. And that is India, and it is not. So I think we need to look much deeper into India to be able to form that comprehensively. I think our religious divides are less, we only have to give them less airtime. I think media and politics tend to exaggerate the religious divides. Most of these divides come from cultural manifestations, not from the innate philosophy of different religions. And therefore, it's easier for us to temper them. Coming to the economic and sociological aspects, I think we have divergent growth rates. I actually wrote a piece on this in the Financial Times last year. East and North are growing about 12% slower than West and South. And sooner or later, this divergence may mean people in the South will look at it and say, why is my tax money going to fund somebody in UP? People in Tamil Nadu will wonder. We have our population under control. Our per capita income is growing. Our absolute GDP is growing much faster. Our per capita is growing even faster. And why do I have to carry these guys? Those kinds of frictions will emerge. We have a high population density. So industry versus agriculture type of zero-sum games will emerge faster in India than in some other countries. And those are challenges which we'll have to tackle. We have to identify those challenges and we have to tackle.
Interesting. So you mentioned quite a few statistics in the conversation. How do you, and this is more of a question stepping back. You both a philosophical thinking hat and a private equity hat. How do you put your philosophy to practice? So how do you really think through these kind of pluralism, these kind of divergent arguments? How do you personally handle these kind of things?
You know, I think the way I would look at it is don't be dogmatic. Be practical. Tinker. Believe in experimentation. Step back if something doesn't work. Right? And I think when Satya Nadella became CEO of Microsoft, the advice he got from Steve Ballmer, who was his boss, and he says, Satya, I'll tell you one way to reinvent Microsoft, which may in some ways be one way to reinvent India. He's saying, be bold, but be right. So in other words, be bold only when you're super confident of what you're doing. Don't be bold for the sake of it. So that would be my kind of philosophical view to our social transformation.
Interesting. And how do you draw from, what do you generally do to deeply think about these issues? What are your regular periodic practices that you do to deeply think about these issues? Because I think you'll agree to the fact that the whole Enlightenment project or the last 200 years of global, I know I'm just trying to cluster all of it in a homogeneous entity called globe. We are all heterogeneous within that, but just for the sake of the argument, we've seen that the last 200 years have given a lot of fruits in terms of using reason, what Steven Pinker calls the Enlightenment now, using reason and science for the progress. And yet you find that in the last 20 years, things have moved from monodisciplinary thinking to interdisciplinary approaches, where people are now looking at key questions of the day through different lenses, through different disciplines. How do you personally practice this on an ongoing basis? How do you do this?
Let me make a light point first, and then I'll go to the more serious points. So let's say I tried economics, viewing the world from the lens of economics. And today, as we know it, and every so often, we say, well, the present time sucks. So you try and look at the world from the lens of psychology. And psychologists will tell you, well, your childhood had issues, and therefore your current state is bad because your past sucked. Okay, I'm just saying it in a very light-hearted way.
Yeah.
Then you look at the future, and the politician will tell you, well, the future sucks unless you vote for me. So having given up on all of that, I've turned to philosophy. Okay. This is a light-hearted statement. Now, on a more serious note, I think you've got to blend various disciplines. You have to believe in technology, you have to believe in economics, you have to believe in politics, governance. You've got to believe in public policy. You've got to believe people will work hard. You've got to believe in diversity of views. So I tend to read a lot. These days, I've discovered the joys of podcasts. So I've been hearing a lot of podcasts. I tend to interact with people outside my natural domain. Because if you believe in the power of ideas, those ideas and best practices come from outside your everyday function. I think that keeps breadth, not just breadth of information, also keeps you fresh. So that's been my kind of toolkit.
Interesting. This is a good segue to the wonderful work that you're also part of as a governing board member, INET. How did this whole association come about?
Well, so INET, as you know, is the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York. It was principally funded by George Soros. And I've known the INET folks for a while. We met here, there, we met in Davos. I met George Soros. I had dinner with George Soros in Davos, and so on and so forth. And emerging markets are a very important part of economics today. So they're always looking for inputs from emerging markets. So they invited me to be a part of the governing board, although I'm not a trained economist. Most of the other people are from the discipline, from public policy and economics and so on. And I was happy to. So if you believe in the power of ideas, as I do, INET, I think, is a force that can really change the world. So INET, or many of these types of organizations, have two pillars. One is theory. So the joke in economics is new economic thinking is reading old economics textbooks, because the fundamentals of economics will not change. But at the margin, you can still tinker and say, okay, how about this? How about that? The core of economics will remain the same. So one of INET's big things is ideation, taking cutting edge ideas, developing cutting edge ideas from a theoretical perspective. The second part is empirical evidence and practice. What works in implementation? What are the feedback loops? What's going on? INET transcends both of these. They fund research at universities. They do a lot of work with people who cut across borders. So economics and politics, which is political economy, development economics, psychology and economics, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And I think they're doing some very good work. Of course, India, from my perspective, I want it to be a working laboratory for INET work. So one of my aims is to see how INET can get more and more involved with what's going on in India.
Interesting. And what are some of the key questions that are very, very central to INET's existence? Are there some very few fundamental questions that they really keep coming back to, that is sort of their lighthouse?
whatever the global challenges are. So growth, poverty, climate change, current economic challenges because of COVID-19.
Right.
So it's the same set of challenges that anybody would really grapple with. They are doing it more from a intellectual, systematic perspective with a longer term view than most other organizations.
Interesting. Coming back to your own, business and your private equity, we see that a lot of things are happening around organizations, inside and around the organization. So within the organization, you have newer models of organization structure. So the whole idea of concepts like empowering people a lot through models like, let's say, holacracy, where you decentralize decision making and stuff. And then a lot of technology disruption is happening again within the workforce, how they function, how they plug in for their works, and also in terms of the disintermediation that is happening. How have you been thinking through this entire technology disruption that is happening in the world?
I think technology is a tool. It is a force for good or bad depending on how we use it. I think technology has made life much more efficient. It has democratized business. A lot of startups are able to function in the technology world, especially because of technology tools that have been made available by the bigger companies. If you look at benefits to the consumer, and if you look at what China has been able to do to bring masses into the formal economy because of their technology platforms, it's just unparalleled. Technology, of course, has winner-take-all characteristics, many of the technology businesses. And therefore, people fear whether that kind of monopoly power will be misused at a certain stage. So Microsoft faced their challenges in the late 90s. Facebooks of the world are facing the same challenges today. Then there is fear that will technology displace jobs, especially in poor countries like India and so on and so forth. My own view is jobs will evolve and technology will force people to work in a different way. Okay. So we've gone, let's say, from an agricultural society, we've transformed into an industrial society. The transformation is partly in India, partly going on in India today. It's going on around the world. Second transformation that has happened or is happening is from an industrial society to an information age. I think there's a fourth change that is happening, that is from the information age to the age of imagination, as the futurist Rita King called it. An age of imagination need not mean you need to be a script writer for Netflix. It could also mean how you process and move inventory. Zara, as an example, has reinvented its inventory processes based on technology. So one simple insight they had was, why do I need the same stock in every store? Who said that? If I run out of stock in one store, that's okay. The cost of carrying stock so that I have uniform supply around the world or around stores in America is just dysfunctional. Why would I do it? They've reinvented. So their inventory turns based on their technology platform now. And this insight that I don't need to have the same stock around different stores has just rotation of capital and therefore return on equity has shot through the roof. So the age of imagination is possible because technology tools enable you to do a lot of things that you couldn't do earlier.
Interesting. In fact, when you were giving this example about Zara, I was reminded of the great Harvard professor Clayton Christensen, who wrote a lot of, and who was really revered because of the work that he'd done in terms of really understanding deeply what does the consumer or what does the person really want in his theory called jobs to be done. And the challenge that one also sees, or maybe it's a great opportunity to solve, is that each of us, we keep coming up with a lot of ideas through the day, through the week, through the year. And then when we get into conversations with people who matter to those ideas, there's a way in which the whole conversation architecture is currently. Now, do you see fundamentally there are also this reimagining of conversation architectures that are required in the way we converse with each other, in the way I really try to deeply understand and listen to what you're saying, and then from there try to co-create, co-sense things and ideas?
I'm not sure I've understood your question actually, so you might have to re-articulate it.
Okay, so what I was saying is that while you said that imagination is a great currency in times to come, and each of us will have, let's say if there was an imagination quotient we all had, and there was a way to map it, I'm sure everybody would have some level of imagination quotient. To me, a simple yardstick is if a person can lie, then the person can imagine. You actually thought how the other person thinks. So what I mean to say is that each of us can keep coming up with ideas. Now, when we have to implement the ideas, we have to collaborate with people around, sometimes inside the organization, outside the organization, with the community. Now, when we do that and when we share the ideas, there is this human nature that kicks in, the motivations, the biases, the jealousies, the pride, the identity, the trust, and all those things kick in. As they kick in, they do not allow for a certain kind of conversation to flow in a certain manner. So do we also require two kinds of things? One is new form of conversation architecture, where, for example, let's say if this conversation were to happen in a slightly different way, then you speak for 5 minutes and then I speak for 5 minutes. We also take silence in between. We have the opportunity to say, I do not know. We can have healthy dissent. I can steel man your argument rather than just straw manning your argument, so on and so forth. So do you think that there is a need for new kinds of conversation architecture for interpersonal interactions?
You see, a couple of things. One, Peter Drucker is still relevant today. So his book, I think it was written in the 60s, called The Effective Executive or whatever, I think is 100% valid even today. Okay. So first, believe in Drucker. Nothing has changed. One thing I think that has changed is we are dealing with flatter organizations. We are dealing with gig economy type workers, people who are signing up for projects rather than lifelong employment with the company, right? And so on and so forth, which is changing the nature of the interaction and the incentives. So you have a situation today where a techie in Google will say, I will not work on this project. It's working for the US defense, and I think it's wrong to kill people. And if you force me, I'll quit. I'll go someplace else. 25 years ago, this debate would not have been as real as it is today. Okay. So you've got to balance the various needs of your team and your organization and your ecosystem, because a lot of these people are not now a part of your organization, but a part of your virtual organization. And carry them. The nature of managing teams has changed, but the fact that you still need the same skills to manage those teams has not changed. The fact that big companies will get complacent and not be able to ideate in the way we are thinking about gives an opening to young companies. Microsoft did it to IBM in some ways. Google did it to Microsoft. Facebook did it to Google. Somebody will do this to Facebook.
Yeah, interesting. Right. Interesting. Let me take this thread a little more further and just see how you would respond to this. So there was a time in history where a great number of people on the planet would do work with their motor functions, with their hands and legs, create things, and come and show you. And let's say if you're a buyer or somebody who wants to judge what I've created, you have something tangible to see, right? I'm not debating that there was still a subjectivity element to it. What I mean to say is, in today's time, there is a lot of people. I'm not saying a huge population, but there is a substantial population which matters the needle to be moved in the direction of a certain kind of lifestyle, certain kind of decision making, what they're ending up creating through the day, through the week, through the month is extremely subjective in nature, because we are trading opinions and judgments, and that's not something which is very tangible. I'm not creating this pen which you can keep and there is tangibility to it. So there is large scale intersubjectivity involved. And do you see that as both a bug and a feature in some sense in our current way in which the society is being constructed?
I think what you're calling subjective may be subjective for a short while. But over the course of any meaningful decision-making time frame, I think there are objective decisions to be made. So you may have a point of view on how to tackle XYZ problem, which is a service-related problem, and therefore more subjective rather than a product-related problem, saying how do I make this wheel in this car more reliable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the end, by testing, experimentation, ideation, etc., you'll be able to say, yeah, this doesn't work, or this works, but only to this extent, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that we have to grapple with guesses. I still think the scientific principles, the so-called scientific principles of management, will still apply to the service and subjective economy, the way you're saying it.
Okay, fair point. So how are you? What are some of the open questions for you currently, in the sense where you spend a lot of time thinking about, reflecting about, reading about, or conversing with people about?
Well, it depends on your areas of interest, I suppose. For me, I'm interested in public affairs, so I think a lot about politics. I'm interested in transformations, so I think a lot about or talk a lot about technology. Because I work in the world of business, of course, I think a lot about business and economics. There is a hidden philosopher inside of me, so I think in terms of psychology, philosophy, and supernatural, and those kinds of things. And it's an interesting. It's interesting.
Interesting. You interact with a wide array of people across across geography and disciplines. What are some of the things that really come and become very poignant for you, where you really feel really optimistic, and you feel that there is a greater power, greater force that is going to take us in the right direction?
Let me talk about how our views or my views have changed over, let's say, the last 2 decades.
Yeah, that will be great, please. Yeah.
So 20 years ago, I would have overrated intellect. Today, I know that intellect is overrated. And if I had to trade part of my intellect, what would I take instead? If you had to trade part of your intellect, what should you buy by selling a little bit of your intellect? So I found 2 things that I want to buy, or we should buy, we underemphasize until later in life. One, I would trade part of my intellect for courage. I think if you see the world of entrepreneurship and even otherwise, even political entrepreneurs, the world rewards courage more than intellect. I often say that. So I would trade a part of intelligence. You should be willing to trade part of the so-called intelligence for courage. Second, to scale, you need teams. Okay, I can have a great idea, I can work on it in a small way. So I would trade part of my intellect for empathy, which helps me build teams, which help me in my cause. So that's one of the lessons that at least I've learned. The second thing that makes me optimistic, and I think in some subjective way, I think I've learned to trust isms less and be scared of dogmas. Okay. I think there is a happy medium between extreme points of view that firstly works better. Secondly, it's more saleable. Thirdly, if it doesn't work, it's less disruptive. So you can recalibrate much faster, and so on and so forth. Fourth, I believe life is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it was Henry Ford who said, whether you believe you can do something or you can't do something, you're right. So life in that sense is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And my biggest source of inspiration is the fact that I believe in the human agency. So I don't remember who said this, but it was said in Urdu, and I'll read it out. खुद ही को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. Before writing your destiny, God asks you. You have to make yourself so strong that God asks you, what is your opinion? So in that sense, we have to and we can write our own future.
Very interesting, Gauravji. Towards the end, how do you manage your inner life? What do you do? What do you do on a regular, periodic basis? Or what have you done over the decades and you've shifted and you've come to now start doing it more?
Well, I think what we've realized is that what I've realized is we look for happiness or peace or joy or relaxation outside. So let's go to the Italian Riviera. Okay. I think it actually lies within you. So you can look inwards and find pretty much, it's a state of mind. You can find pretty much all of that. Second thing is we tend to shirk from hard decisions. And I can't remember who it was who said, hard decisions, easy life, easy decisions, hard life. So if we shirk from hard decisions, we inevitably have a hard life. So it's easier to bite the bullet today than kick it down the road. You know, third, getting it intellectually is easy. Getting it in practice is much more difficult. You know, so there's this story from the Mahabharat, which I often quote, where Dronacharya is teaching the Kauravas and the Pandavas, don't ever lie. So the classes go on and he keeps asking all the students, have you learned the lesson? And all of them say yes, except Yudhishthira, who says no. And an exasperated Guruji asks Yudhishthira after a while, what's the problem? It's so easy. And Yudhishthira says, yeah, but I've never had a chance to test this. I understand it, you should never lie. I've never had a chance to test this. So I think those are the things when you go inside, you're able to figure it out a little bit better as to what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, the wonders inside you, the wonders you can do, etc., etc.
Interesting. Any closing notes you would want to share with us? Anything in particular?
Well, my favorite poem is Kipling's If. So I would encourage everyone to read it. And it talks about what we in Hinduism may call Maya. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Right? So whether it's to do with stock market turbulence or personal circumstances or whatever, right? It's an important thing to remember. And the final part of that poem is if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. So to me, those are profound words.
Unbelievable. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Gauravji, and this wonderful poem and a note to end on.